In the end, government either serves the productive, patriotic, hardworking American citizen, or it serves those who break the laws, cheat the system, and seek power and profit at the expense of our nation. Look at Minnesota, where Somalians have taken over the economics of the state and have stolen billions and billions of dollars from Minnesota and indeed from the United States of America.
You just heard that with your own ears. And let me tell you right now that what we just witnessed is not hyperbole, not metaphor, not political theater designed for clickbait consumption, but rather an absolutely chilling articulation of the most dangerous form of racial nationalism that has festered at the heart of reactionary politics for centuries, reanimated now with terrifying precision and amplified through the machinery of state power, because this moment demands that we reckon with what is actually happening here, beyond the shallow parsing of words and their phonetic delivery. Trump called Somali immigrants garbage and said he doesn't want them in our country, which represents a quantum escalation in the dehumanization project that began with his 2016 campaign trail declaration that Mexican immigrants were rapists and has metastasized through every subsequent iteration of his political existence into something far more sinister, because what we are observing is the systematic construction of an entire community as ontologically incompatible with American life, as existential parasites who have supposedly stolen billions upon billions of dollars from the body politic, and I need you to understand that. Trump said Somalis ripped off Minnesota every year for billions of dollars, but the White House didn't provide evidence for those figures, which matters tremendously because the fabrication of economic predation has historically served as the primary justification for ethnic cleansing across continents and through epochs. Let me be exquisitely clear about the intellectual architecture underlying this horror, because Trump's speech operates on multiple registers simultaneously, and each one deserves surgical deconstruction, starting with the empirical dimension, which reveals his claims to be not merely exaggerated, but fundamentally inverted from reality itself. Economist Bruce Corey's estimates show Somali Minnesotans generate at least $500 million in income annually, pay about $67 million in state and local taxes, and have an estimated $8 billion impact on the state's economy, which demolishes the central premise of Trump's diatribe with the force of irrefutable data. And furthermore, Somali Minnesotans have a higher labor force participation rate than the general population at upwards of 70%, meaning that the very people Trump accuses of parasitism are actually working at rates that exceed the broader citizenry. These are not marginal refutations, but wholesale inversions of his narrative framework, yet they will barely penetrate the consciousness of his audience, because the function of fascist rhetoric has never been to describe reality, but to construct an emotional architecture that permits violence against designated others. And what Trump is doing here with his billions and billions mantra is weaponizing the aesthetics of fiscal conservatism to smuggle ethno-nationalist genocide into the discourse as though it were a matter of sensible budgeting. Wait, because it gets so much more devastating when you examine the fraud allegations themselves, which Trump exploits with the cynicism of someone who understands that most Americans will never investigate the actual details. Prosecutors estimate the Feeding Our Future fraud at $300 million, with 78 defendants, and yes, many of the defendants were Somalis, and most of them were U.S. citizens, although the alleged ringleader was white, which immediately complicates the racial morality play Trump attempts to stage, because if we are genuinely concerned with fraud qua fraud, then we must prosecute all perpetrators regardless of ethnicity, but Trump has no interest in that universalist framework, because Governor Walz said to demonize an entire community on the actions of a few, it's lazy, and that laziness is precisely the point. Minnesota is home to more than 61,000 people with Somali ancestry, out of approximately 5.7 million people statewide, meaning Somalis constitute barely over 1% of Minnesota's population. Yet Trump constructs this microscopic demographic as having taken over the economics of the state, which is numerically absurd, logically incoherent, and semiotically revelatory, because what he is actually saying beneath the fiscal language is that any presence of racialized others in positions of economic agency constitutes an illegitimate occupation of white economic space. The language of takeover and invasion saturates every sentence Trump utters, and this cannot be dismissed as rhetorical flourish, because political science professor Brendan Nehan notes that Trump's descriptions of people from other countries and other racial and ethnic groups as subhuman animals is the kind of language we see in countries before they have ethnic violence or even genocide, which locates this moment not in the shallow temporality of election cycles, but in the deep history of atrocity. Some of Trump's comments mirror language used by white supremacists, such as his claim that immigrants are poisoning the blood of the country, with Adolf Hitler using the term blood poisoning in Mein Kampf to criticize the mixing of races, and the fact that we must continuously articulate these parallels suggests a catastrophic failure of collective memory, because fascism does not arrive announced with swastikas and book burnings, but rather through the normalization of eliminationist rhetoric, disguised as fiscal responsibility and border security. What Trump is engineering here is the discursive groundwork for mass deportation, as he has promised to carry out the largest domestic deportation operation in American history, and the Minnesota Somali community serves as a test case, a laboratory for refining the propaganda techniques that will justify the displacement of millions. Now let's excavate the staggering hypocrisy embedded in every syllable of Trump's performance, because while he fulminates about stolen billions and demands accountability for fraud perpetrated by some members of the Somali community, Trump granted clemency to a private equity executive who had been sentenced to 7 years in prison for his role in a $1.6 billion fraud scheme, which reveals that his concern is not actually with fraud as such, but with the ethnic identity of the perpetrators. White-collar crime committed by white executives receives presidential pardons, while alleged welfare fraud by Somali Americans becomes grounds for collective punishment and potential expulsion from the country. And this asymmetry is not accidental, but constitutive of how white supremacy operates within ostensibly race-neutral legal frameworks. The fraud narrative serves as what critical race theorists would identify as a racially coded proxy that permits the expression of eliminationist racism while maintaining plausible deniability through the invocation of law and order discourse, and the conservative movement has been perfecting this technique since the Southern strategy because explicit racial slurs have become socially unacceptable in elite spaces, even as the underlying architecture of racial domination has merely upgraded its user interface. But here is where the analysis must sharpen into something even more urgent, because it began enhanced operations in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, immediately following Trump's rhetorical assault, meaning that his words are not mere speech, but rather the discursive component of a coordinated state violence campaign. SIPI released a list of 12 people arrested, with 5 from Somalia, half from Mexico, and 1 from El Salvador, describing them as some of the worst criminal illegal aliens. And notice how the categories collapse together into an undifferentiated mass of racialized threat, because the function of these operations is not primarily to remove specific individuals with deportation orders, but to terrorize entire communities into a posture of perpetual fear and vulnerability. Urban planner Abdoulaye Abdoulaye said many in the community have started carrying passports and legal documents every time they leave their homes in anticipation of being stopped by ICE, which transforms citizenship itself into a probationary status subject to revocation at any moment. And this is what scholars of authoritarianism call the production of precarity, as a technology of governance that keeps marginalized populations in a state of suspended deportability, regardless of their actual legal status. The economic dimensions here are almost incomprehensibly cynical when you actually examine them, because Trump's entire political brand is built on the mythology of him as a brilliant businessman who creates jobs and generates wealth. Yet when confronted with Somali workforce participation suggesting an economic impact of roughly $8 billion, which is larger than the economies of many Minnesota counties, proving Somali labor plays an active, measurable role in the state economies, participations tikin kopikas, participing labor has always been deeply schizophrenic. Capital loves immigrant workers when they can be exploited as cheap labor in agriculture, meatpacking, service industries, and care work, but becomes hostile the moment those same workers begin to accumulate modest wealth, open businesses, purchase homes, or achieve any degree of economic security that might threaten the racial hierarchy. Somali people now make up the second largest immigrant population in Minnesota, with at least 70% of working-age adults holding jobs, and as Ahmed Yusuf notes, they are lawyers, they are doctors, they are actually millionaires, they are in the city, they are in the state, they are in corporate America, they own their own businesses, which represents precisely the kind of intergenerational mobility that American mythology celebrates in the abstract but finds threatening when embodied by Black Muslim immigrants. Let me pull back for a moment to situate this within the broader cartography of Trump's anti-immigrant campaign, because in December 2023, Trump said that undocumented immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country, and has said immigrants are criminals who will cut your throat, establishing a consistent pattern of dehumanization that spans his entire political career. But the Somali-specific rhetoric represents a dangerous refinement, because he is now naming specific communities by nationality and geography in ways that create the conditions for localized pogroms. Trump announced in a Thanksgiving message on Truth Social that he would permanently pause migration from third world countries, specifically blasting the Somali community in Minnesota, and the deployment of the term third world is not merely dated, but explicitly racialized, because it conjures civilizational hierarchies that position white European nations at the apex of human development and African nations as primitive spaces requiring containment. This is the core ideological formation of white supremacy, reasserting itself through immigration policy as a mechanism for preserving the racial composition of the polity. And Trump's demand that Somalis go back to where they came from echoes his 2019 tweets about 4 congresswomen of color, including Ilhan Omar, became the first Somali American elected to Congress, the first woman of color to represent Minnesota, and one of the first 2 Muslim women elected to Congress. The targeting of Ilhan Omar specifically reveals how Trump's anti-Somali campaign operates at the intersection of racism, Islamophobia, misogyny, and xenophobia, because Trump called Somali people garbage and sent immigration enforcement agents into Minnesota, with DHS officials touting arrests and hate mail pouring into mosques and advocacy groups. Trump called Omar garbage and said his obsession with me is creepy, to which Omar responded, "I hope he gets the help he desperately needs." And her response demonstrates the psychological toll of being subjected to sustained presidential harassment for years, while simultaneously having to maintain composure and legislative effectiveness. Omar has been the target of derogatory comments by political opponents, including Trump, as a result of her background, and has been the target of several death threats, which moves beyond political opposition into the realm of stochastic terrorism, where presidential rhetoric creates the conditions for right-wing violence against named targets. I want you to sit with the historical parallels here, because the construction of a racial minority as simultaneously economically parasitic and culturally threatening has served as the justification for expulsion and extermination across continents and centuries, from the Spanish Inquisition's targeting of Jews and Muslims through accusations of corrupting economic systems, to the Ottoman genocide of Armenians framed as a national security threat during World War I, to the Holocaust's central obsession with Jews as both capitalist exploiters and Bolshevik revolutionaries, to the Rwandan genocide's depiction of Tutsis as foreign invaders who monopolized power and wealth. Scapegoating immigrants for everything from crime to unemployment has proven an effective strategy for maintaining racial exclusion and political power, despite overwhelming evidence that immigrants are law-abiding, tax-paying members of society, and the persistence of this strategy reveals that it serves expressive rather than instrumental purposes, because it allows white working-class voters who have been economically immiserated by neoliberal capitalism to redirect their rage away from the actual architects of their dispossession and toward vulnerable racialized populations. The fraud narrative deserves particular scrutiny because while the feeding our future case is real and the defendants should face justice, there is a very real fraud scandal involving some individuals of Somali ancestry. But these are separate issues from the harmful narrative claiming the Somali community has no value or is garbage. And the conflation of individual criminality with collective culpability represents a form of reasoning that is only ever applied to racialized minorities. When white Americans commit fraud, embezzlement, or financial crimes, we do not suggest that Norwegian Americans or Irish Americans should be deported en masse, or that their entire community bears responsibility. Yet, Trump launched into a 2-minute denunciation, claiming Somali Americans contribute nothing and should go back to where they came from, with the comments met with loud applause, which reveals how readily audiences will embrace eliminationist rhetoric when it is directed at appropriate targets. Almost 58% of Somalis in Minnesota were born in the U.S., and of the foreign-born Somalis in Minnesota, an overwhelming majority of 87% are naturalized U.S. citizens, meaning that the vast majority of people Trump is targeting are American citizens whose claim to belonging is legally indistinguishable from his own, except for the fact that they are Black, Muslim, and arrived more recently. The temporal dimensions of citizenship and belonging are doing so much ideological work here, because nativist politics always construct an imaginary golden age, when the nation was supposedly pure and homogeneous. But Somalis have consistently arrived as refugees from Somalia's civil war since the early 1990s, finding Minnesota appealing because of available social services and welfare programs that helped them resettle, which means they arrived through legal refugee admissions programs that were functioning exactly as designed to provide humanitarian protection to people fleeing war zones. Citizens of Somalia were first given TPS status in September 1991 under Republican President George H.W. Bush. establishing that both Republican and Democratic administrations recognized Somalia as a country experiencing conditions warranting protected status. Yet Trump now retroactively delegitimizes that entire refugee regime as though it were an elaborate scam rather than a cornerstone of America's post-World War II humanitarian infrastructure. The refugee system emerged from the ashes of the Holocaust and the recognition that nations have obligations to people fleeing persecution, but the contemporary right seeks to dismantle that architecture entirely because they view humanitarian protection as a vector for racial demographic change that threatens white political dominance. Now observe the absolutely breathtaking hypocrisy embedded in conservative economic discourse. Because Republicans claim to worship at the altar of entrepreneurship, small business creation, and economic dynamism, yet economist Bruce Corey notes Somali entrepreneurs, particularly women, are building businesses and strengthening civic life, with Somali contributions essential to Minnesota's workforce and future growth, and Somalis work as truck drivers, nurses, manufacturing workers, and retail staff, reflected in small businesses at Carmel Mall in Minneapolis and countless other small businesses across the state from St. Cloud to Rochester. This is the bootstrap capitalism that conservatives claim to venerate until it is embodied by black immigrants, at which point it becomes threatening rather than laudatory. Industries such as retail, healthcare, manufacturing, and transportation would face immediate disruption if Somali workers left Minnesota, which reveals the profound dependence of the Minnesota economy on precisely the workers Trump seeks to expel. The contradiction is not accidental, but reveals how capitalism's relationship to racialized labor operates through cycles of recruitment during labor shortages, followed by expulsion during economic downturns or periods of white backlash, and Somali workers are now experiencing the backlash phase of that cycle. The public health dimensions of Trump's rhetoric cannot be overstated, because when a sitting president repeatedly calls a specific community garbage and claims they contribute nothing while deploying immigration enforcement against them, businesses receive hostile calls with people saying, "Go back to your country, you're a filthy Somali," and restaurants experience reduced business, with some customers staying away out of fear of immigration agents, which demonstrates how presidential rhetoric creates material conditions of economic precarity and psychological terror. Following Trump's 2024 election win, there has been a significant surge in anti-Asian hate online, including threats of violence and slurs, with Trump's xenophobia fueling hate offline, raising serious concerns about potential rising racism, discrimination, and violence against Asian communities during Trump's presidencies, establishing that his rhetoric produces measurable increases in hate incidents, not merely against the specific groups he targets, but across multiple racialized communities, because the underlying permission structure he creates is one where targeting anyone perceived as foreign becomes normalized. Let's interrogate the civilizational discourse Trump deploys, because his constant invocation of countries that stink and people who come from failed nations reveals a worldview organized around racial hierarchies disguised as developmental economics. Trump has escalated his anti-immigrant demagoguery, saying, "They're poisoning the blood of our country," and claiming immigrants come from Africa, from Asia, all over the world. They're pouring into our country. The construction of immigration as an invasion or infestation positions migrants not as individuals seeking safety and opportunity, but as a contaminating force that corrupts the body politic, and this biopolitical framing has direct genealogical links to scientific racism, eugenics, and the social Darwinist logics that undergirded European colonialism and the Nazi regime. When Trump says these countries are no good for a reason, he is articulating a theory of national character that attributes poverty, violence, and state collapse to intrinsic deficiencies of the populations rather than to centuries of colonialism, Cold War proxy conflicts, structural adjustment programs, and extractive capitalism that actually produce those conditions. The absolute audacity of the United States lecturing Somalia about dysfunction when American foreign policy in the Horn of Africa has consistently prioritized counter-terrorism partnerships and weapons sales over development assistance deserves more attention than it receives in mainstream coverage, because Somalia gained a UN-backed government in 2010 but remains marred by violence and corruption, with al-Shabaab controlling swaths of southern Somalia, and the ongoing instability is not some natural feature of Somali society, but rather the product of decades of Cold War superpower competition, followed by disastrous American military intervention in the 1990s, followed by decades of securitized engagement that has militarized the society while doing nothing to address underlying governance challenges. The people fleeing Somalia are fleeing conditions that American foreign policy helped create, Yet Trump positions them as though they are vectors of those problems, rather than victims of them. And this inversion is characteristic of how empire manages its refugee flows, by simultaneously producing displacement through intervention while demonizing the displaced for seeking refuge. The gender dimensions here are crucial because Somali entrepreneurs, particularly women, are building businesses, which represents a profound challenge to both white patriarchal norms and conservative Muslim patriarchal norms, positioning Somali women as agents of economic transformation. Yet Trump's rhetoric completely erases their labor and contributions. Muslim women who wear hijab are particularly vulnerable to harassment and violence because they are visibly identifiable as Muslim in ways that men are not always, and ICE agents mocked a woman for wearing a hijab during enforcement operations, revealing how immigration enforcement operates as a vector for Islamophobic misogyny that specifically targets Muslim women for humiliation. The intersection of anti-blackness, Islamophobia, and misogyny creates conditions of extraordinary precarity for Somali women who are simultaneously marked as foreign, religiously suspect, and subject to both Islamophobic and anti-black violence. I need you to understand that what Trump is doing is constructing a permission structure for ethnic cleansing, because Trump said he's immediately terminating temporary legal protections for Somali migrants in Minnesota, claiming Minnesota was a hub of fraudulent money laundering activity, and that Somali gangs are terrorizing the people of that great state, and billions of dollars are missing, writing "send them back to where they came from." Yet a report put the number of Somalis covered by TPS at just 705 nationwide, meaning the actual legal impact of this announcement is negligible, but the symbolic and terroristic impact is enormous, because it signals to his base that Somalis are legitimate targets for removal, regardless of their citizenship status. Trump announced terminating temporary protected status for Somali migrants, affecting just 705 Somalis nationwide, with state leaders and immigration experts characterizing Trump's declaration as legally dubious effort to sow fear and suspicion, which confirms that the primary function is psychological warfare rather than actual deportation. The community response to this sustained assault has been remarkable in its resilience and clarity because the wave of vitriol during the Trump administration's immigration crackdown has been met with an opposing wave of solidarity in Minnesota, with state leaders quick to publicly embrace the community, and people were saying that Minnesota Somalis are as Minnesotan as tater-tot hot dish, which represents local resistance to federal eliminations rhetoric, through assertions of belonging rooted in cultural citizenship rather than formal legal status. Walz called Trump's statements vile, racist lies and slander towards our fellow Minnesotans, and Hams Warfa, a Somali-born entrepreneur, said, "I am not garbage, I'm a proud American citizen," articulating the dignity and humanity that Trump's rhetoric seeks to strip away. The fact that this affirmation of humanity is even necessary represents the degradation of political discourse under Trump's presidency, because we have reached a point where an American citizen must publicly assert that he is not garbage in response to presidential declarations. This is a fight over the very meaning of America, because at stake here is whether the United States will be a multiracial democracy organized around principles of equal citizenship, regardless of national origin, or whether it will consolidate as a white ethno-state that uses immigration enforcement as a tool for maintaining racial hierarchy, and Trump is quite explicit about which vision he prefers. The president-elect and advisors like Stephen Miller promise a deportation campaign of historic scale with ambitions to remove not only the estimated 11 to 13 million residents without documentation, but also hundreds of thousands of people who had been offered temporary protected status during the Biden administration, which would represent the largest forced population transfer in American history, and would require a level of state repression that would fundamentally transform American society into something unrecognizable. Trump and advisor Stephen Miller have described plans to federalize state National Guard personnel and deploy them for immigration enforcement, arresting people in homes and workplaces across the nation, which represents the militarization of immigration enforcement in ways that would normalize armed federal agents conducting raids in communities across the country. The ideological work being done by the accusation that Somalis are stealing billions bears examination because theft implies illegitimate acquisition of resources that rightfully belong to someone else, which constructs public assistance programs as white entitlements that racialized others are pilfering rather than as universal social programs available to all eligible residents. This logic has deep roots in American racial politics from the Reagan-era welfare queen mythology through contemporary conservative opposition to any social program that might disproportionately benefit communities of color, and it reveals how social democracy becomes impossible in multiracial societies where white voters will defund public goods rather than share them with racialized others. Xenophobia allows governments and societies to externalize domestic failures, offering easy explanation for problems that are far more complex and often rooted in political and economic mismanagement at home, in austerity, deepening inequality and precarious work rather than in the arrival of strangers, which identifies xenophobia as a deflection strategy that protects capitalist elites from accountability by redirecting working-class rage toward immigrant scapegoats. The economic analysis demonstrates that median income of Somali households in Minnesota was $28,500 in 2020, the lowest of any cultural group. Yet despite this poverty, 84% of individuals reporting Somali ancestry in Minnesota received either state or federal assistance income, SNAP, Medicaid, or a combination of those benefits, which reveals not parasitism, but rather the reality that social programs are functioning as designed to provide basic subsistence to low-income families. Because Somalis have a higher poverty rate than other groups, it would make sense that they are eligible for more public programs. Yet Trump perverts this logic to suggest that poverty itself is evidence of moral failure, rather than a structural condition requiring social support. The conservative vision is one where poverty justifies exclusion rather than assistance, where need is interpreted as character deficiency, and where social programs are reconstructed as racial redistribution from deserving whites to undeserving others. We must connect these dots to the broader architecture of American fascism that is consolidating before our eyes, because Trump's targeting of Somalis is not an isolated incident, but part of a comprehensive project to reconstruct American identity around white Christian nationalism. Trump grew more explicit in his mission to defend Western civilization and preserve white Christian identity following his 2024 victory. The deployment of phrases like Western civilization is not coincidental, but represents an effort to position white supremacy as cultural preservation rather than racial domination. Yet the operational content remains identical, because what is being defended is racial and religious homogeneity against contamination by racialized others. Xenophobia isn't rational, and cannot be explained in a politic way, because it is not a politic feeling which acknowledges that we are dealing with psychosocial formations that exceed rational discourse, and must be understood through frameworks that account for unconscious drives, civilizational anxieties, and the psychological wages of whiteness. The path forward requires not merely defensive resistance, but offensive vision, because we need to articulate an alternative conception of American identity that is genuinely multiracial, genuinely inclusive, and organized around solidarity rather than hierarchy. And this requires material redistribution, not just multicultural recognition, because it is easier to blame immigrants for the economy and eroding social fabric than CEOs and politicians who supported trade deals that moved well-paying manufacturing jobs outside the country. But identifying with immigrants let down by their own government would be intolerable as a matter of pride. Yet if we sat with that shared vulnerability, would the answer to our problems still be detention centers? This analysis points toward the necessity of class solidarity that cuts across racial and national lines, because working people, regardless of citizenship status, share common interests in challenging the power of capital. Yet that solidarity is systematically disrupted by xenophobic narratives that position immigrant workers as competitors rather than comrades. The testimonies of Somali community members reveal extraordinary dignity under assault because Abara told The Hill that Somalis are not, and I am not, someone to be intimidated, and we are not going to be scapegoated, and this refusal to accept the victim position Trump assigns them represents a form of political resistance that insists on agency, even under conditions of extreme vulnerability. The Somali community did not ask to become the focal point of Trump's eliminationist project, but having been positioned there, they are fighting back through assertions of belonging, economic contribution, and political voice, and their resistance creates space for broader coalitions, because when one community successfully resists demonization, it weakens the entire apparatus of xenophobic scapegoating that threatens all racialized minorities. We are watching in real time as a community refuses the terms of its own dehumanization, and that refusal is itself a form of abolitionist praxis that models what collective resistance must look like in an age of ascending fascism. So the question that remains is whether the broader left will rise to this moment, with the clarity, courage, and systemic analysis that this catastrophe demands, because the stakes could not be higher, and the hour could not be later, and the choice could not be more clear between a multiracial democracy or an ethno-state, and there is no middle ground remaining.